Please welcome John Bishop.
Well, good morning, guys. It's a real delight to be here, and been looking forward to this. We are shaped by the experiences that we go through in life. So let me tell you a little about what's shaped me. My father went over with a heart attack when I was 17 years old out in Kansas City. And we were a low-income, middle-income family at best. College was not really an option to start with, but when he died, it just completely evaporated. So like a lot of young men, this was 1960, I enlisted in the Navy, went into the service to serve, because we're only 15 years out of World War II, and young men in that era, that was part of what we did. But also it was an opportunity to get access to the GI Bill, which was basically my only possibility of hopefully getting an education. So I go out to San Diego for boot camp, and two very significant things happened out there. The first was that's where I came to faith in Jesus. Back in those days, chapel was mandatory for all the recruits, and so every Sunday morning they formed up 3,000 or 4,000 recruits, marched us to a big auditorium, and we heard the gospel because the Navy chaplains at that time were all evangelicals. I could not have said it that way, but they preached the gospel, and there was a moment on a Sunday where I said, that makes sense, and I went forward. The second thing that happened, clearly under the leadership and the hand of God in one of these miraculous ways, I was selected, I was pushed to get an application, got it in, and wound up getting an appointment to the Naval Academy. So from having no opportunity to go to college in a relatively short period of time, I wound up going to one of the finest colleges in this country. Spent 4 years at the academy, and as my 4-year time there drew to a close, we had to make a decision about where we were going to serve as a graduate. We would take a commission in the Navy, or at that time take a commission in the Marine Corps. I opted to take my commission in the Marine Corps primarily for two reasons. One, at 21, I did not know how much capacity I had, or anybody has at that age, for leadership. But I felt whatever I had, the Marine Corps would do a better job of developing that than would the Navy. That's kind of a noble reason. But after a cruise on a destroyer and on a submarine and getting terribly seasick on both of them, I decided the life of the sailor was not the life for me. So I graduated in 65, landed in Vietnam in April of 66, spent a year with the 3rd Marine Division out in Vietnam. Came back to headquarters Marine Corps, and that's when I met Doug Coe and all the folks supporting the Congress in a thing called the National Prayer Breakfast. Left active duty in 72 to join that group full-time in supporting the Congress. I share that with you because the first 12 years of my journey with Jesus was learning about war, training for war, going to war, recovering from war. Everything that I did for 12 years was shaped by warfare. And if those of you can remember the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement and all that was going on in the country at that time, it was a pretty intense time. And so that shaped me. When I joined the breakfast and the fellowship to try to be a part of that, it was about reconciliation. It was about helping people come together and heal some of the divisions and to love one another. So being a Vietnam veteran was not a positive thing in those days. And it was particularly not a positive thing to be a Marine Corps Vietnam veteran. So I worked hard to jettison, to demilitarize myself, to fit in, and also to have some hope of being able to date the young ladies, because being a veteran was a showstopper for a lot of them. Then in 2007, I went back to Vietnam on a tour, a special tour, 16 days. Went from the Delta to Hanoi to the Laotian and Cambodian borders, places we had been when we were there before. And while I'm riding the bus over to Quezon, which, if you'll remember, the siege of Quezon was probably the bloodiest part of the war for the Marine Corps, I'm on the bus, and it's, as you can imagine, this is a pretty somber, reflective time. And while I'm riding the bus, I began to reflect on my life, and I began to reflect on the experiences that I'd had when I was there. And then I started thinking about, really a poor kid from Kansas winding up going to the Naval Academy. That's not normal. and being in the Marine Corps, and the experience is a privilege, the honor to be able to wear the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. And so I began to ask the Lord, what was that all about? Because for 40 years I had jettisoned that. I had left that. I had denied that in some ways. And man, while I'm on that bus, I believe the Lord said to me, those days were for these days. So in 2007, I put back on my warfare lenses. And I am processing everything that I do through the lenses of spiritual warfare. Because the principles of warfare are the same whether the war is physical or spiritual. It does not make any difference. The principles are the same. So part of what I'd like to do this morning is just share with you some of the things that I have learned and come to understand as a result of looking at life through these lenses of spiritual warfare. Those lenses help you to see things that you would not normally see, and they help you to see other things differently. And so I just want to share a few things that I've learned. First of all, one of the more obvious things is that we're at war. Man, we're born and born again into a world at war. And to deny that reality is dangerous, and it hurts a lot of us because we don't focus correctly on what's happening to us. I'd like to illustrate that in terms of how much we sort of are ignorant or disconnected from this reality. How many of you are familiar with the passage where Jesus says, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly? Okay, that's the second half of John 10:10. How many, and do this by a show of hands, how many of you can tell me what the first half? And those who I shared this with, please don't steal my thunder here. How many of you, by a show of hands, can tell me the first half? One? This is normal, guys. The first half of John 10:10 says, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. The abundant life that Jesus is talking about, man, I believe, comes from getting engaged in the battle to keep the thief from stealing, killing, and destroying. We've taken a passage of Scripture and we've divided it and developed a whole theology around it, which is bad theology, that it's all about life and the abundant life, disconnected from this reality of warfare. We got to get in the fight, guys. We've got to process this, and let me do this a little bit differently to kind of help you get a way of seeing something. Columbine, Virginia Tech, Aurora, up the road, Sandy Hook, Orlando, San Bernardino, Brussels, Paris, and now Las Vegas. We tend to think of these as separate and disconnected, isolated events. But men, they're not. They're part of a coordinated agenda of the thief to steal, kill, and destroy. What they represent are simply times and places where the thief found a willing ally to help him carry out his agenda. This says at the top, the Washington Post. What is this? Fake news. Close. It says the Washington Post. That's what's the top. We look at this and say this is a newspaper, right? Gentlemen, I want to tell you, when you look through spiritual warfare lenses, what this really is. This is today's record of the thief's agenda yesterday. This tells us where, in this case, the Las Vegas government, where he was carrying out his agenda. This is how the thief gets his glory, is when his agenda gets published. That's what this is, okay? Jesus has an agenda, and Jesus is calling men to be his allies in that agenda. And his agenda is the establishment of his kingdom. And when we get in the fight as the allies of Jesus to establish the kingdom, we're taking the fight to the thief to keep him from stealing, killing, and destroying. And as we establish his kingdom, that's how we destroy the work of Satan. And we're called to be his allies in this great endeavor, establishing his kingdom. Well, that's the first thing I've learned. We're at war. Second thing I've learned is that we're all wounded. War creates casualties, and we are all wounded men. We're wounded from the fall, for sure. Sadly, many of us are wounded from the sins of others. And then we're also wounded in most cases by our own sin and folly. We're wounded men. It's interesting to me that when we start our journey with Jesus, we start wounded. In the military, we have a thing called the $1 million wound. It was a wound bad enough to get you out of the fight, sent home, not bad enough to disfigure or disable you. That was the $1 million wound. You got healing in that case by getting out of the fight. With Jesus, everything in Jesus is the opposite of our normal inclinations. We live by dying. We lead by serving. We become first by being last. We become strong by being weak. Everything in Jesus is just the opposite. So for us, healing comes from getting in the fight, not out of the fight. And what I'd like to do, I'm going to circulate. I don't know how many have seen this. Maybe some of you veterans, maybe some of you earned one of these. This is a Purple Heart Medal. We award these to the men and women who get wounded in action, WIA. And we give these to the next of kin for those killed in action. And I deeply believe that when Jesus was here, he earned 2 of these. Scriptures tell us he was wounded for our transgressions. And I believe he was killed in action at the cross. And I believe that it's at that point of our woundedness that Jesus most desires to connect with us. He wants to connect with us at that point of woundedness and do for us what was done for him in turning those wounds into scars. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pass this around. I'm going to ask as you grip it that you seek in that moment to let this connect you to that point of your own woundedness. And just say, Jesus, I want to connect with you. Okay? I'll circulate that. Another thing I've learned. Not only are we at war and not only are we wounded, but we have weapons with which to fight this war. And we're called to use these weapons. Paul says the weapons of our warfare are not carnal but mighty. And what I've discovered in doing this is that most men don't really understand what a weapon is. You might think of a shotgun or a 30-06 or a 45. When that shotgun's pointed at a goose, it's a shotgun. But here's a definition that I've come up with to help you understand what happens when you change the line of sight on that shotgun to somebody's trying to rape your wife. A weapon is anything that you can use that destroys your enemy's ability to wage war against you. That's a weapon. So, this can write a letter or a note or a book. It's a pen. But in the eye of an attacker, it becomes a weapon. So the understanding that I have from this passage in 2 Corinthians is that we have things, we have assets, we have these resources to combat the attacks of Satan, the enemy, the evil one. And so in this spiritual dimension, I always start with 2. We have a whole arsenal, but let me give you 2. The first one is forgiveness. Men, when we forgive, we destroy Satan's ability to wage war against us through anger, bitterness, rage, hostility, alienation, dysfunction. We take the fight to the enemy when we forgive. It's one of those powerful weapons in our entire arsenal. The second weapon is generosity. When we're generous, we destroy Satan's ability to wage war against us through the love of money and the deceitfulness of riches. But our generosity also takes the fight to the enemy because it helps free the poor. Our generosity should help those folks in poverty to free them from that. So we're taking the fight when we're generous. But generosity isn't limited to just our resources, to our money. And I want you to think about this one. Words of encouragement. As you move into your sector today, I want you to think about just looking for someone to give them a word of encouragement. Be generous with your encouragement. And some of you next week might be able to come back and say, you know, I did this, and here's what I'm going to tell you. My words of encouragement at that moment to that person in those circumstances was worth more to them than money. We can be generous with our words of encouragement. We can be generous with our kindness. You know, kindness is a phenomenal tool. It's so powerful, according to the Scriptures, that it has the capacity to produce change, to produce repentance. Paul says in Romans 2:4, do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing the kindness of God leads you to repentance? You got a problem with someone, you alienated, you don't like them, they're the enemy, whatever. If you want to win them, you want to have an impact on them, do the opposite. In other words, don't confront them, but what? Be kind to them. If I could go to the Middle East and had the power, the first thing I'd say to every believer over there is learn to be kind to the Muslim. They don't have any concept of what that is in their culture. But that would be more than anything else could probably communicate the love of Jesus. And it's interesting when we think about kindness, how does Paul define love? Love is patient and love is kind. He talks about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. Be generous in that. That's an aspect of generosity that we really don't think about. We get it confined to money. I start with those two because they are two of the four cornerstones of God's love. God's love gives, for God so loved he gave, and God's love forgives. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. So men, if we're not givers and forgivers, we're not lovers. I'm not really sure what we are, but I don't think we can lay claim to the title of being a lover if we're not a giver and a forgiver. It just doesn't seem to me to work. And I don't find, in most cases, men being challenged, the way I'm trying to challenge you this morning, to be a giver and a forgiver. And I want to remind you in this process that our standard is God himself. And when God gave, he didn't give 10%. He gave all. He gave all he could give us when he gave us Jesus. And when he forgives, he doesn't forgive 10%. He forgives all. So if we look at generosity, I think we've got to look at it from a different vantage point. We've got to look at it from the aspect of all. Start there. Well, that might sound kind of spooky and kind of, whoa, that's I'm not ready for that. Well, I'm not ready for it either. But I'll tell you what I am ready for, and what I want to challenge you all to be ready for, is hearing the voice of Jesus. The challenge here is to go to Jesus and ask him. This is all yours. My checkbook, everything I have it's yours. It's all yours. Now, Jesus, how do you want me to handle it? What do you want me to do with it? The goal here is not to define wealth or to define generosity. The goal here is to hear the voice of Jesus. And when you begin to hear the voice of Jesus, then numbers and percentages and should I or shouldn't I, that all starts to change. It's hearing the voice of Jesus. And let him define for you what it means to be generous. I think, men, when we stand before Jesus, he's going to reward us on the basis of what we give. I think he's going to judge us on the basis of what we kept. And we need to be thinking about this. We live in a culture, we live in a whole world that's driven by accumulation, by acquisition, by money, by those kind of things. And I think it's time in this warfare mentality to sort of review the bidding on this and begin to go to Jesus and ask him how to do this. In Vietnam, I carried a M16. Start out with an M14, then we switched over to M16s and a 45. My Marines carried hand grenades. Those are individual weapons. Giving and forgiving are what I would call individual weapons. But we also had a thing called crew-served weapons. In other words, it took a team to operate these weapons. Artillery, tanks, machine guns, mortars. It took a team. In this spiritual battle, fellowship, a little band of brothers, is a crew-served weapon. And so when we saw this video here as one, the things we talk about in energy groups, those are far more strategic than I think most men realize. I can find only a handful of things in life that Jesus intends for us to do by ourselves. We are born individually. We die individually. We come to Jesus, the cross, individually. We enter the narrow gate individually. And we stand in judgment individually. But on the other side of those, instantaneously, there's a group. You're born into a family. You're born again, you're into what we'd most of the times call the church. You enter the narrow gate, you should find a band of brothers. And after judgment, you either join the community of the damned or the community of the redeemed. There's nothing in life that I know of that he intends for us to navigate by ourselves. So in the discussions of generosity, it's not an isolated discussion. You know, in the first 4 chapters of the book of Acts, everybody knew what everybody else had. There was no secrets around their finances. Ananias and Sapphira got whacked when they tried to game the system. So building a community around the things of life, for example, just maybe there's somebody in your life that you need to forgive. Well, that may not be the easiest thing in the world for you to do. And you may need courage. And you need encouragement. And we get that from being a part of a little band of brothers, a little fellowship. That's a crew-served weapon. That's, as the Lance Wallnau video, that's when we really begin to take the fight to the enemy, when we do it as a band of brothers. So I want to throw that out there as something that this is not a nice idea. This is a strategic, critical idea that you begin to engage with just a handful, 2 or 3 other guys, as brothers, as friends, as comrades, as our Native American folks understood this. It's a covenant. It's a lifelong relationship. It is nothing dissolves this. And that's the way I believe that we're to experience this in Jesus, as a small community, a band of brothers. So in this journey with Jesus, we're at war. And I want you to be aware of that, process it, begin to look at life through those lenses, and you're going to begin to see things and understand things differently because of that reality. You know, Max Dupree said the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality, and the second is to say thank you. I think one of the reasons that this nation is suffering from a lack of leadership is the inability or the refusal to define reality. We're not dealing with reality. We have an adversary. Las Vegas is just another illustration that there's evil in the world, and that evil is part of the devil's agenda to steal, kill, and destroy, and he's not going to stop. So, we're at war, and we have weapons. And I want to challenge you to become skillful, committed to learning how to forgive, learning how to be generous, learning how to be kind, learning how to serve. I mean, everything that's defined as a spiritual discipline becomes a weapon once you understand how it impacts the kingdom of darkness. So I'll give you one more little challenge, kind of tie this in a little bit. If I had a video camera and we had the opportunity to video your entire life, from conception to today, there would be certain spots on that video where we would look at that and we'd stop, we'd probably have tears, we'd see that set of circumstances, and we would say, Satan really kicked your ass right there, didn't he? He hammered you. Well, how would you like to kick his for a while? How'd you like to turn the tables? We turn the tables by forgiving. We turn the tables by being generous. We turn the tables by being kind. That's how we are to be enlisted in the army of Jesus, to be his allies in the great endeavor, agenda of establishing his kingdom. So I'm going to stop there. The clock says I have a few minutes, just in case there's a comment that someone would like to make or a question. But when you walk out these doors, guys, I want you to walk out. First of all, I want you to walk out humble. Walk humbly, knowing the one for whom you someday must stand and give an account. But while you walk humbly, I want you to walk tall, because you're a friend of the King. And while you walk humbly and you walk tall, I want you to walk with someone. I want you to walk together. I want you to walk as part of a band of brothers. Darien, Connecticut, New York, wherever you work, wherever you circulate, can be different if you'll do that. Thank you.